I've been through a lot of horrendous stuff, and now I want to keep myself safe from it ever going back there again. When I left spirituality behind, I almost immediately went completely headlong into an entirely opposite point of view, an entirely opposite worldview. In a way, I found sanctuary in this worldview that was just so polar opposite to what I used to believe. I went from New Age spirituality and believing in, almost anything that resonated to, an atheist point of view, where I was very invested in shutting down a lot of these ideas and explaining these ideas away. Something that I've realized recently is that, to some extent, the drive for me to do that, to shut those things down, to explain those things away, was coming from a place of self-preservation. It was coming from a place of, I've been through a lot of horrendous stuff, and now I want to keep myself safe from it ever going back there again. So that's something that I want to talk to you about in this video. We need to talk about spiritual trauma. So let's talk about this. Hey everyone, if you're new here, I'm Andy Fellows, and if you're a former New Ager like me and you're interested in a more grounded approach to New Age spirituality, then why not subscribe to the channel and hit the bell? You are in the right place, rest assured. I want to be really clear just before we jump into this, I'm not like an expert or anything on trauma or anything like that. Trauma is a bit of a buzzword at the moment, and there's a whole industry cropping up around it, and I'm not playing into that really. I'm not an expert on this, I'm just sharing my experience here. You may agree with it, you may relate to it, you may not. Either, absolutely fine. If you do disagree and decide to leave a comment, though, please do that respectfully, please. So for me, acknowledging and facing healing from what I think we can call spiritual trauma has been something that I've come to recently, in recognizing that my responses to a lot of this kind of stuff, it's not always coming from the rational point of view that I'd like to think it is. It's often coming from a much more emotional place. And that's not to say coming from an emotional place is bad necessarily, but it's not coming from a place that's like totally fine, And so for me, the thing that's really interesting is being able to understand how much is my response to spiritual things in general coming from a place of like reasonable, sort of rational point of view of someone that wants to try to understand things and pick things apart a little bit and understand what's going on underneath, versus coming from a place of like intense pain and like fear of like, please don't take me back there. And I realized that often that is a feeling I have when I come across some of these things, especially if I find myself going, oh, I can see, I can see where they're coming from, or I can understand how they got there. There's a part of me that's just like, whoa, no, please don't take me back there. I don't want to go back there again. A good example of this is we were watching the Midnight Gospel, my wife and I, maybe a year or so ago, and there's a guy in there telling his story. Now, this guy's fascinating story. The guy calls Damien Eccles, if you want to look him up. The guy is called Damien Eccles, if you want to look him up. Can't speak apparently, and his story is it's a heartbreaking story and an inspiring story as well. This is someone who went through awful situation. He was young, he was practicing magic, he got caught up in the satanic panic, ended up getting put on death row, and then it's his magical practice that kept him going, like mentally strong, until he was eventually released because they realized he was wrongly convicted. It's a horrible, heartbreaking, terrifying story, and he's telling that story in this Midnight Gospel, which is like an animated podcasty kind of thing. And it just set me off, like to the point where we paused it and I just went for like 30 minutes ranting about, he's saying this and he's saying that and he's making these claims and it's not verifiable and blah 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 blah. That was the language of someone who is approaching these things from a rational point of view, but certainly not the attitude of someone who was coming from this from a rational point of view. It was coming from somewhere else. And so something that I'm fascinated with at the moment is really being able to understand how much of my approach to these things is coming from that place of like, I've been through something really bad. And for me, at least where the channel's concerned, it is in service of being able to have a more rational point of view. If I can understand where a lot of my pain and a lot of, the fear and stuff around this kind of thing is coming from, then I can have a more rational, a more grounded point of view when it comes to talking about things that are spiritual and so on and so forth. So just sort of getting clear on what I mean when I'm talking about spiritual trauma. You might be familiar with some of my story already. I'm going to give a short version now, so if you're not up to speed. Basically, in sort of 2012 time, a close friend of mine died, and I didn't know what to do with the grief. And then I ended up finding this teacher, leader on the internet who spoke with a degree of certainty that I didn't possess, and was very convincing, very alluring, very charismatic, and I got sucked in. And following their practices, following their advice, living as they would encourage their followers to live, went really badly for me, to the point where my life was not the same as it was before. A lot of my relationships were damaged. I wasn't speaking to family for at least a year at one point. A decent chunk of my family, I didn't talk to them for at least a year. My mental health ravaged, absolutely in pieces, and I was a lot worse off because of it. And then after that, I almost overcorrected within spiritual parameters, to the point where I went from being involved in what was effectively what I would now call like a pseudo-therapy cult, to being involved in something that was incredibly emphasis on spiritual bypassing and dissociation, sitting there emptying your mind and just being in a state of bliss all the time. And there you go, that's God, you've met God or whatever, you're now in your true self and blah blah blah. But then that, ironically, somewhat paradoxically, made me a much more controlling person, a much more neurotic person, a much more insecure person, because I guess to some extent I was always trying to grapple to attain that state of peace. So anything that happened around me was getting in the way of that in a way. I needed to just be in this state all the time. Long story short, that is. Let me just interrupt myself just 1 second to say you should definitely follow me on Instagram if you're enjoying the content I'm making and you want to hear more from me on these kinds of issues. There's always stuff that doesn't lend itself to a full video, that's better expressed in a paragraph or 2 or 7 sometimes. So I've been sharing that over on my Instagram. So if you're on Instagram, make sure you definitely follow me on there. But anyway, back to the video. So needless to say, through 2 very different forms of spirituality, one that I would now say is a cult, the other definitely destructive if taken to the extreme that I took it to there, but maybe in smaller amounts you could perhaps find a way to make it healthy. But I know that there's at least one teacher I used to follow that is now currently being spoken about as a cult leader, so take that as you will. And all this stuff just went very badly for me. It was just a very bad situation, to where at the end of that I just swore off of it. I was just I don't want to do this anymore. I don't want to be involved in this anymore. No, thank you. It's taken me years to get to a point where I don't feel terrified when spirituality comes knocking in my life, when people talk with any degree of certainty about the truth of their beliefs. That just sets me off, or it did for a very long time. Less so these days, but we're getting there, So when I'm talking about spiritual trauma, I'm talking about that for myself in reference to those experiences, in reference to how badly that went, and how, I would say to some extent, a lot of it was predisposed towards going badly for anybody, and those who it doesn't go badly for are very fortunate. I think how badly that went for me has left me dealing with a lot of shit, and I'm only really now realizing the scale of what I have to sort through with this, to where I can find a place in me where I don't feel terrified when these kinds of ideas come around in my life, to where I can explore these kinds of things and feel safe in myself, and feel like I can trust myself to not get sucked in, or to not lose myself, or to not go back there, in that way that I feel so terrified of when these things do come up. Can we just take a moment to appreciate the sheer fucking irony of having to recover from the trauma of being involved in a group whose emphasis is on recovering from trauma? Can we just take a moment? Rip. Okay. As we were. I think for me, critical thinking and sort of rationality in general became a safe space where I didn't have to worry about any of that. I didn't have to deal with any of that. I could just be here, and it was all nonsense to some extent, to a lesser or greater degree, and I was safe here. And I didn't ever have to worry because I could explain everything. And if I could explain it, then it wasn't real and I didn't have to worry about it anymore. But what I'm coming to recently, and this is something that I'll perhaps talk about in the future more, is understanding quite deeply that there is a value in believing in untrue things. That's not to say that I think it's a good idea to believe in things that you know are untrue, but there may be a value in believing in something that is untrue, because you may benefit from it for reasons other than what you believe you're benefiting from it, you know. And of course, it's important to maintain a balance there. Of course, it's important to protect against cults and undue influence in general, you know, and the destructive ways that these things can go. And just look back at my rather substantial back catalogue of videos making the case for critical thinking. I'm absolutely still feel as strongly about critical thinking being a really important part of keeping us safe from the ways that these things can go destructively. But at the same time, I'm learning now to come to a place where I think that rationality can provide a service to our human nature and our well-being in one particular way, in that it can potentially create a safe space. Rationality can potentially create a safe space wherein we can be safely irrational. And we can explore the mystical, we can explore the supernatural, if indeed it is a real thing, and you know, I'm not sure that it is, where we can explore faith and these kinds of things without falling prey to destructive cults, without falling prey to things that are gonna fuck us up to the point where we have to spend, like I have here, fucking 6, 7, 8 years recovering from it. And I was only involved in like the cult thing for like 2 years. Like, yeah, that's ridiculous. That's a long time to recover from something that I wasn't in for that long, you know. So let's prevent that. Let's absolutely prevent that where we can. But, you know, not being in a cult doesn't mean that there's not a place for spirituality in people's lives. And while I'm not necessarily the most quintessentially spiritual person these days, I'm certainly more open to it than, let's say, your average atheist is. And although I would say I've softened to agnosticism somewhat lately, you know, I think there's definitely a way that these two can coexist. I don't know that way, and I think it's a deeply personal thing. I think that each individual has to figure that out for themselves and try to understand what's right for them, not what's true for them. I think that's something that we need to find there's a line there, because I feel like truth is something that can be verified. But if you believe it's true, that's a different thing, I guess. And there's some nuance there to be explored. If you're enjoying this video, as we're going through it, by the way, and if you think that spiritual trauma is an important topic to be discussing, then please hit the like button on this video. Let me know. I do think that this thing is a very personal thing, though. I do think that it's a very intimate and individual thing in a way, that we have to figure out what's right for us, because who the fuck knows like what's going to help one person and what's not going to help another person? Who the fuck knows what's going to make one person's life better and one person's life worse? And I think ultimately that is a big part of navigating this issue, because it is a conversation about how we want to live, not maybe about what's true, but who we want to be, how we want to live, the life path we're choosing for ourselves, you know? Because honestly, I think the issue of whether something's true or not isn't something that's always brought up until someone challenges the truth of something. And then it's like, well, it's true because X, Y, and Z. But when you're believing in something, when you're invested in something, whether it's true or not is not always on your mind. It's the experience of it that's on your mind. It's how it makes you feel that's on your mind. It's the value you may be getting from it that's on your mind, you know. So to that extent, I think there may be a value in believing in untrue things, but I think it has to be navigated using rationality. And I think that's where I'm learning from like my own experiences here to be able to protect myself more from these things in future. But I'm now learning to do that in a way that's not just a knee-jerk, terrified reaction of, no, that's too close, but actually now like learning to navigate these things from a more rational point of view, to deal with my own shit myself and then not superimpose that over the things that I'm seeing and doing, you know? So ultimately working through my own shit with regards to how bad spirituality went for me in the past, how I guess traumatized you could say I've been by it, to where I'm able to now have a more rational view of these things and be able to provide you with videos that are more even-handed and more rational and more down to earth, you know? I always talk about how I want to provide a rational, a grounded point of view, you know? And I hope that pursuing this in this way, working on this stuff for myself, is going to make it possible for me to be able to provide you with that in the content that I'm making. But of course, hopefully always with a sense of humor. And one thing I do have to say while I'm talking about this is that for me, working through this has happened with a counsellor. I'm doing this, you know, with that support. I'm not doing this on my own. And if that is available to you, please do that if you're going through something similar. I can imagine many people, you know, you're watching this channel for a reason. I can imagine it's possible you've been through some form of destructive spirituality, a cult. A lot of people I've spoken to who watch the channel have been, or maybe even through some sort of destructive organized religion, you know, and now you've come out of it and perhaps are looking for that point of view that's more rational, more grounded, more down to earth, that's not gonna expect you to believe anything. And that's something that I'll maintain on this channel. I don't expect you to believe what I believe or approach things the way I approach things. To each their own, and please always feel free to disagree with me. But I think if you've been through something similar to what I've been through, then it's possible that sooner or later, whether now or in the future, you may come to a similar place that I'm coming to, where you're realizing, oh shit, I've got some baggage there, I've got some pain there, I've got some trauma there, if you like, that I now need to work through if I'm going to be able to navigate the world and exist in the world without, you know, these issues feeling like a minefield emotionally. So that said, if you do have access to therapy and you are going through something like this, then please take that opportunity to get that help. This is not something that you should have to do on your own. Also, if you're interested in the resources that have helped me get to where I am right now, then check out the link in the description to one of my sites. So resources link, I've got so many links on there for you to check out and that you can sort of explore and see if there's anything on there that can help you with where you are at the moment. So yeah, let's please have more of a conversation around how destructive spiritual and religious experiences can inhibit our capacity to be rational when exploring these issues in the future. Let's have more of a conversation about that, hopefully in the pursuit of, you know, better mental health and a more rational pursuit of these things, and ultimately to enable each of us to figure out what works for us and to find our own way with this kind of stuff that is best for helping us live the life that we want to live. When I'm making videos like this, there's always stuff that like I can't include, be it due to like time constraints or because YouTube doesn't like you talking about certain things on the platform. So one of the things I've started doing is making like an audio companion thing over on my Patreon. So if you're interested in hearing a little bit more from me on topics that I'm discussing on the channel, then make sure you check out the Patreon. There's a link in the description. Check out the tiers, see which one's right for you. Also, I do just want to say, yes, my eye is bloodshot today. It was soap, okay? I got soap in it. It was soap. I'm Andy Fellows. Please remember to subscribe to the channel. If you've enjoyed the video today, hit the little bell thing so you get notified anytime I upload a video. Otherwise, please be kind and ask good questions, and I'll see you in the next one.